All right, should we get started?
How are you?
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Here comes everyone on Zoom.
Oh my God, yes, so cold.
Okay, well, welcome back. It's great. Welcome to everyone on Zoom. It's great to be back in the Kislak Center. We had a wonderful opening to the semester last week with Adrian Johns, but unfortunately on Zoom only due to the snowstorm. So good to see you all for the spring semester, and particularly pleased to be reopening the spring in-person semester when our speaker is our own Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text, Priya Nambrath. Thank you, Lynn. Is anyone's volume on? Is there still an echo? I'm not hearing an echo.
Now.
Okay. All right. I'm Zach Lesser in the English department. As you know, I co-run the seminar with John Pollock at the Kislak Center, who is also today's today's Bristol Schoenberg Substitute Fellow. And Jerry Singerman, Humanities.
Doing nothing today.
I was not going to say as usual, but he's filling his role over there in the corner as Humanities Editor Emeritus from the Penn Press. And as you know, Priya typically makes sure everything runs smoothly every week, here in person, on Zoom, via email, and at dinner. She's even doing that this week when she's here, however, in her scholarly capacity. And so John will be monitoring the chat and can bring any questions to our attention during Q&A. You can also use the raise hand function and ask your question live at that time. And until then, please remember to mute yourself. The sign-in sheet is going around as usual. So if you'd like to get on our email list, you will hear from Priya once or twice a week. Just add your email to next to your name on the list, or put a request in the chat, or go to our website, pennmaterialtext.org. One other thing about the website, there you can find information about our annual Stallybrass Prize in the History of Material Text, which is now open for submissions.
And
There's Peter. That prize is open for submissions now. You can see how to submit through the form linked on the website. It honors the best essays written by Penn students, one in an undergraduate category, one in a graduate category on any topic dealing with material texts. And all the requirements are on the website. If you're a Penn student, or if you've read a great essay by a Penn student in one of your classes, we encourage you to check it out. Okay, on to our talk for today. Priya Nambrath is a PhD candidate in South Asia Studies here at Penn and the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text. Her dissertation focuses on the history of math and science in medieval and pre-modern India, educational and pedagogical traditions, European colonial encounters with Indian mathematical systems, manuscript studies, and archival studies, particularly in Kerala. Priya is well prepared to work on math and science, as she holds an MS in computer science from the University of Texas at Dallas and an MBA in finance from the Stern School of Business at NYU. Her research on South Asian intellectual and scientific history and material texts has been supported by a Fulbright Fellowship by the American Philosophical Society and the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. There's a nice article on her work in Omnia, which is Penn's magazine for the School of Arts and Sciences, where she comments on the importance of humanistic inquiry, even in areas we might not immediately expect. She says, "My STEM background had encouraged me to think of mathematics as a kind of universal language, not susceptible to cultural and historical nuance like art, music, and literature. But what I was seeing in Indian mathematical texts convinced me otherwise." She has essays forthcoming in several journals, and she's developing a module, or maybe this is done, I couldn't tell the timing, a module for the Penn Museum that links artifacts and galleries there with mathematical cultures. I believe today's talk is one of those side projects that happen when you're deep into archival research about your main project. It spans 4 centuries and several continents, and is called Scribal Worlds in Motion, Loss, Identity, Afterlives. So please join me in welcoming Priya to the front table.
Like this?
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, Zach, for that lovely introduction. Express my thanks to Zach, Jerry, and John. It's been an absolutely wonderful experience serving as this year's fellow. And I'm really grateful for your support and mentorship. And it's truly an honor to present tonight as part of this very distinguished and long-running series. So thank you all for being here, and a very good evening to you all. Not to forget the folks in Zoom. Thank you so much for sharing your time as well. So I want to set the stage here first by saying that this is very much a work in progress and is the subject of a forthcoming book chapter that I hope to submit in the next few months. And so any and all feedback from that aspect will be most welcome. This is the overall structure of my talk, and I'll be signposting it along the way. I'd like to begin with a personal story, an account of how I first met the Vyaswise archive, while still identifying potential primary sources to work with for my doctoral project in the history of Indian mathematics. I came upon an intriguing description of an archive housed in the Bodleian that didn't have a whole lot of scholarship around it, but the little that had been written was quite interesting. The late classicist and historian of mathematics, David Pingree, compiled a massive 5-volume reference work, The Senses of the Exact Sciences in Sanskrit, that's foundational for any work in this field, and manuscripts from this archive figure very strongly in this bibliographic census. So that was very encouraging. A second article on the growth of Sanskrit scientific libraries in early modern India discussed this archive in some more detail, describing it as a family collection that grew over 15 generations and 4 centuries, and belonging to a family of hereditary astronomers and astrologers, and that very strongly represented astronomy, mathematics, calendrics, astrology, celestial divination, and related ritual practices. The archive was framed as a significant resource, a fragmentary but recoverable repository of authored technical texts with the potential to shed useful insights on the history of Indian astronomy and the exact sciences. It also had a history of its own, a wonderful backstory of transcontinental travel that I will come to shortly. So I decided to go over and take a look and hopefully identify a manuscript or two to work on as part of my doctoral research. To cut a long story short, what I found was a collection of very diverse materials spread across 5 large boxes, like this one in the image, that was not scientific in its narrow sense, or even quite conforming to Jyotish Shastra, which is the name of the discipline of astronomy/astrology as it is conceived of in the Indian context. Clearly, this was not a curated institutional archive or a library assembled through patronage, nor did this collection privilege authorial coherence or disciplinary purity. It was a slow realization that, unfortunately, for various reasons, these manuscripts would not suit my doctoral project. But the question lingered, the obvious question of what was this I was looking at? And this is the interior of one of those 5 boxes. What was the value of this archive, if any, as a family collection, as a communicative object, as a scholarly or scholastic trove, or something else? Had its remarkable travels affected its identity and constitution? Sale, damage, loss, the usual things that we think about. And I realized that I was wrestling with these questions because this archive was speaking back. It was resisting this description of being an astronomical library and insisting on communicating something else. For reasons that I will get into shortly, my opinion is that it is best understood as a scribal family archive, and that its later redefinition as scientific is a scholarly transformation and not a recovery. This tension between scholarly description and material encounter motivates my second question. What is obscured when we accept that classification as self-evident? So my examination of the Vyaswise corpus had revealed something strikingly heterogeneous, an uncurated collection of hundreds of manuscripts, mostly in Sanskrit, but also in Gujarati and a few other North Indian vernaculars, whose dates range from the early 16th to the early 20th centuries. Much of it is still in its original wrapping of Indian newsprint, as in this and some of the earlier images. And here, astronomical and mathematical materials coexisted with grammatical excerpts, ritual texts, computational aids, classical poetry, philosophy, and scripture, and writing practice, quotidian lists, casual doodles, and stacks of correspondence. There were complete texts running into hundreds of pages and partial copies, sometimes as little as a single page fragment that defy clear attribution. Levels of polish varied widely, and signs of use, such as exercises, corrections, marginalia, and practical computations, were ubiquitous. The archive presented itself as dense, layered, practical, and internally uneven. It certainly held scientific content, but crucially, it did not appear to be organized around categories that historians of science would be eager to recover. The archive has been mentioned in the earlier, has been described in the earlier mentioned literature as the collection of a Gujarati family of astronomers named Vyas, and hence the first part of the name of the archive. The second part derives from its global travels, and I will come to that in the second half of this talk, but I want to keep our focus on the archive itself for now. And rather than engaging in a comprehensive inventory of the archive's contents, I'd like to focus instead on the patterns that emerge across these manuscripts, patterns of incompleteness, juxtaposition, and use. These patterns reveal a mode of textual preservation oriented towards continuity rather than canon formation. They also raise a fundamental methodological question: what if this heterogeneity is the point? What if the archive is not disordered science, but rather ordered scribal life? Stepping away then from the assumption that this archive must be scientific, a different set of questions emerges. Why would a family preserve such a wide range of manuscripts across generations? Why travel with them? And later, even when the collection had changed hands several times, why refuse to break up the collection, even under conditions of extreme displacement? This brings us to the notion of scribal families, which is crucial here. Apprenticeship, inheritance, and embodied practice are embedded in such familial structures, and archives emerging from such contexts are maintained not for preservation or display, but because they are useful, authoritative within a lineage, and integral to family identity. The contents of this archive likely reflect the kind of texts that were most in demand among clientele who would have commissioned the Vyasas in a scribal capacity to either make fresh copies of old and decaying texts that may have been used in personal or family worship, or for the purposes of teaching, personal study, or public recitation, or an occupational practice such as ritual and astrology. For the scribal community, then, texts are tools, credentials, and resources. From this perspective, the archive's heterogeneity is not a problem to be solved or noise to be filtered out. It's merely evidence of a different angle of a different logic of preservation. And these perspectives are not mutually exclusive, they just generate different histories. When understood as being oriented towards users rather than authors, the archive does not simply preserve texts, it preserves relations to texts. It functions as a family legacy, preserving intellectual capital, as a pedagogical archive, evidencing instruction and apprenticeship, and as a communication object designed for use, not display. This reframes the question of its value as not merely epistemic, but social and familial. The surviving wrappings of Indian newsprint reveal clear evidence of an original classificatory logic. These images show two such attempts in 1923 and 29, as indicated both by the inscriptions and the newsprint, when the manuscripts were still in Gujarat in India, perhaps as part of a larger collection. They also tell us that the owners of these manuscripts consumed news in both English and the vernacular, giving us some idea of their social status. One of the most consistent features of the archive is the prevalence of partial texts, truncated, reorganized, or interwoven with other materials. This sits uneasily with an author-centered model of textual preservation in which completeness and fidelity to an original work are normative. Yet within a scribal context, partiality is neither anomalous nor deficient. Excerpts and selections can be pedagogical tools shaped by the needs of instruction and use, or they might reflect what was deemed essential at a particular moment, or they could register the material conditions of production, recording what a patron or customer elected to have copied within the limits of affordability. A related feature is the juxtaposition of materials that modern scholarship tends to keep apart. Astronomical tables appear alongside grammatical paradigms and pilgrimage manuals. Computational aids coexist with ritual instructions. Carefully copied verses attributed to named authors sit alongside rough lists, marginal annotations, and corrections that register active engagement rather than passive preservation. Such manuscripts resist classification as either authoritative texts or ephemeral notes. They are both and neither. They occupy a space between permanence and contingency, reflecting practical needs or modes of practice and apprenticeship. And it is tempting to treat these features as peripheral, filtering them out in order to recover a more legible scientific corpus. Inheritance also plays a central role in this logic. For scribal families, manuscripts constituted a form of intellectual capital, resources that enabled teaching, calculation, consultation, and professional authority. Preserving them was not an intellectual or antiquarian impulse, but a practical necessity. Texts were valuable not because they were rare or canonical, but because they were useful and trusted within a lineage. The text of the Saraswati Prakriya here on your left is a particularly striking example. This grammatical commentary was very popular in the region for its brevity and relative simplicity. The manuscript is complete, but has gone through several interesting rounds of repair. You see here that an entire leaf has been replaced, but this seems to have been done only when absolutely necessary, because this is a manuscript of about 50 folios, and you only see this in one or two instances. Wherever possible, the tendency has been to repair as much as possible to retain the original. And you can see an example here of patches applied onto the original manuscript, overwriting, marginal notes, and so on. And it was also important to inscribe new ownership. This image shows the bottom right of this folio has been torn off. That is the portion that contained the name of the original owner. That's been taken off, and a new owner's name has been inscribed. It's clearly not the original one because it's too long to fit in there. But it was asserting that ownership was important. So the patterns of repair seen in these images suggest that the manuscript was valued not so much for its contents, but for its status as an authoritative and attested source for later copies, and as the personal possession of a professional scribe. The pedagogical dimension of the archive is also particularly revealing. Many manuscripts appear designed not for display or long-term preservation, but for instruction. Here, a scribal colophon of an apprentice has been struck out and repeated in what appears like a practice exercise. And I've just highlighted the phrase that's repeated. Here, successive pages of the same hymn are seen to be written in two different hands. And another beginning scribe can barely stay within the restraining grid lines on the page. Yeah. These features suggest a learning environment in which texts function as supports for embodied knowledge rather than as ends in themselves. The archive even includes a few tools of their trade, several scribal boards which show considerable evidence of use. These wooden boards are just large enough to hold a sheaf of manuscript paper, and as is very clear with the one on the right, are shaped in the typical oblong shape of manuscript paper. Such an environment complicates modern assumptions about textual authority. A text that has been copied from, taught from, and relied upon within a lineage acquires legitimacy through practice. Its value is relational rather than intrinsic. This does not preclude regard for authors or traditions, but it just situates them within a broader ecology of knowledge. And this ecology also called for a range of scribal skills that are reflected in this archive. Writing skills, certainly, but also draftsmanship skills that demanded both technical expertise and artistry, as we see in these casual doodles, and the purpose they eventually served, scattered throughout the collection. The archive's heterogeneity also extends to material form. Manuscripts differ in size, layout, script, and quality of execution. Some appear to have been produced with care and resources, others are more utilitarian. This variation confirms that the archive was not assembled at a single moment or for a single purpose, but that it accreted over time, incorporating materials as they were needed and valued, shaped both by the labor of multiple hands and by the sustained activity of the same hands across several decades. Such accretion itself constitutes an archival logic, reflecting inheritance and continuity over selection and curation. Rather than a snapshot of intellectual history, it is a record of intellectual life in motion. And this logic becomes especially visible when we consider the presence of what might be called working texts, manuscripts that bear heavy signs of use, like repeated corrections, overwritten sections, recalculated tables, the image on the top right being one such example, and a few others earlier. Also layered across the archive are lists, sometimes reading like shopping lists, weekly schedules, practice exercises in the Sanskrit alphabet, and playing around with magic squares multiple times and still not getting it quite right. All of this speaks to real lives whose details are now lost. Taken together, these features, partiality, juxtaposition, training, material variation, and accretion, form a coherent pattern of lived knowledge. I turn next to examining how this heterogeneity was reinterpreted through scholarly intervention and trace the transformation of these materials into a scientific archive. This transformation is best exemplified in Pingree's engagement with this collection, a sustained scholarly project over roughly a decade that fed into a larger project of recovering the history of the exact sciences in South Asia and situating them within broader global trajectories. His engagement with the archive must therefore be understood not simply as a matter of cataloging, but also as an interpretive intervention, one that simultaneously expanded the corpus of available knowledge and actively reconfigured the archive itself. Within such a broader project, this archive was viewed as a particularly valuable resource, promising insights into astronomical and mathematical practices, textual transmission, and the development of scientific genres. Pingree approached the collection with the tools and questions of the history of science, and this approach was enormously productive. Through careful philological work, he worked out a plausible family genealogy, isolated texts of scientific interest, established their relative chronology, and connected them to wider networks of information exchange. In doing so, he transformed a heterogeneous accumulation of manuscripts into a legible scientific archive, one that could be mobilized in comparative histories of astronomy and mathematics. The first page in this image lists a text by Kalyana that primarily survives in the Vyasa collection in multiple partial copies. On the second page is a sole surviving copy of a work by Keshava found only in the Vyasa collection. And the third entry is a manuscript that is only one of several copies held by various institutional collections. So you can kind of see the range of these manuscripts and their presence in larger circuits. This work was crucial to the history of mathematics, but it also affected a transformation that came at a cost. The very coherence that made the archive intelligible within the history of science was achieved through a series of classificatory decisions that altered its original configuration. Manuscript covers that had recorded their place in an original taxonomy unfortunately did not survive this new system of classification. New details were first overwritten on them, and then they were discarded as these new catalog details were then transferred onto fresh, clean printer paper. This is unfortunate because the wrappings are, to my mind at least, such an intrinsic part of this archive. They provide clues to the structure of the whole and help retrace the remarkable multi-stage transatlantic journey of this substantial collection at a time of extreme precarity and dislocation. Manuscripts were regrouped according to genre and discipline and evaluated primarily in terms of their contribution to scientific knowledge. Materials that did not align with this framework were treated as ancillary or excluded from consideration. The wrappings that survived did so only because the scholar did not get to them, and that's a sobering realization. And this is how one encounters this manuscript collection today, forever frozen in an eternal moment of transformation. This is not to suggest that Pingree misread the archive or imposed categories arbitrarily. Rather, it is to recognize that his reconstruction was guided by a specific set of scholarly priorities that privileged disciplinary clarity, authored texts, and epistemic content. These priorities are entirely reasonable within the history of science, but they are not neutral with respect to the archive's original logic. The Pingree Papers at the American Philosophical Society preserved some of his notes on the archive, and I was heartened to see recordings like these. This transcription that he made of one of the Vyasa manuscripts notes the dates of the newspapers that it was wrapped in, but this practice is not consistent. The entry above just says Gujarati newspaper and has no dates. Nor do these entries preserve the original notations on the original newsprint. The archive was no longer primarily a record of practice, training, or familial transmission. It became a resource for reconstructing intellectual traditions. And so the very expertise that enables the archive's incorporation into academic knowledge also facilitated its fragmentation. The archive survived displacement, but not interpretation. My argument here does not seek to displace the history of science as an interpretive framework, nor to revisit the analytical priorities that structured Pingree's work, but to insist that the act of recognition is also an act of reconstitution. Archives are not simply discovered, they are produced through classificatory practices, scholarly desires, and institutional contexts. Understanding this archive as a family inheritance also clarifies the motivations behind its preservation during periods of disruption. I suggest that the manuscripts traveled not as isolated commodities, but as a collective inheritance deemed worth carrying. This decision implies a valuation that exceeds immediate utility. The archive embodied family identity, professional memory, and future possibility. To abandon it would have been to relinquish much more than texts, which brings me to the question of its travels and related history. If the archive's heterogeneity and familial logic illuminate how it was formed and sustained, its later history of movement reveals how that logic was tested, preserved, and ultimately transformed. Travel is not an external episode in this archive story, it is a structuring condition of its afterlives. Somewhere along the way, it also acquired its current name, contingent, locational, and in my view, not quite accurate. We've discussed the first half of the name, and I focus here on the second half. As reconstructed by the Bodleian, a junior Vyas studying medicine in the University of Vienna, who had these family manuscripts in his possession, had sold the collection sometime before the start of the war to Mr. Heinrich Kalman Pappenheim, a Jewish community figure and book collector who perished along with his wife and other family members in the Holocaust. In the hands of this Austrian bookseller, these manuscripts acquired a potentially new identity as commodities. Fragmentation could have maximized market value, but the bookseller refused to break up the collection. The reasons for this refusal are not clear, and it would be speculative to assign any single motivation. It might have been an ethical judgment, a sense of custodial responsibility, or an intuitive recognition that the archive's value lay in its coherence rather than its parts. But what matters analytically is that this decision already signals a particular valuation. Again, one of Pappenheim's 3 surviving children, a daughter, carried the collection with her when she married and moved to Belgium. The new couple then sent the manuscripts to their friend, Bernard Hirschler, once the owner of a successful household goods business in Austria, but now a refugee escaping to the southern coast of England, with the request to find a responsible way to dispose of the manuscripts. So Hirschler, fleeing for his life after the Anschluss with his wife and 2 little girls, also carried with him a weighty trunk stuffed with manuscripts, about whose contents and value he could have had no earthly idea. Here, the archive's integrity was not guaranteed by institutional norms or policies of preservation, but enacted through judgment under pressure. It survived not because it was recognized as scientific or valuable in a scholarly sense, but because it was understood as meaningful, however inchoately, to those who carried it. Clearly, efforts had been made earlier to understand its contents, for Hirschler also carried with him a 1938 report prepared in Munich by the Indologist Franz Joseph Meyer, which listed authors, titles, and folio numbers for the 24 earliest manuscripts that he, Meyer, had been able to identify. And some remnants of his analysis are still attached to this manuscript corpus. So you see a couple of small notes marking one is incomplete and the other one is complete. Upon reaching England, however, Hirschler the refugee was promptly imprisoned as an enemy Austrian national. He had been staying temporarily with his cousin and her family, who, as escaped Jews from Hungary, were not imprisoned, as Hungary had remained neutral in the war. On being released eventually, Hirschler emigrated to the United States, leaving the manuscript collection with his cousin, Catherine Weiss. Before he left, he also turned the issue of the manuscripts over to the local church minister, the Reverend Pitt Bonarjee, a converted Indian Christian long settled in southern England and running his own parish there, who in turn contacted the Bodleian with a request to review the collection. Subsequently, in 1940, the Bowdoin professor of Sanskrit at Oxford, E.H. Johnston, reviewed not the collection, but the earlier report and list assembled by Meyer. Johnston took a dim view of the collection as a whole as not containing anything original, but felt that a handful of especially antiquated specimens from the 15th to 16th centuries might be worth preserving. Although he requested that only a few specific items be sent to the library for closer inspection, the Reverend Bonarjee sent the entire collection over in a smooth transfer of responsibility. These decisions made during moments of extreme disruption, like the ones before them and after, are also inscribed on the body of the archive. From 1913, we see Indian newsprint in English and the vernacular, but regional publications nevertheless. More than a decade later, in 1929, another round of packaging and systematizing in Gujarat now utilizes national English newsprint. And later, from 1938, we have the German newsprint that Pappenheim used to wrap certain manuscripts, followed by British newsprint in the same year when Hirschler arrived in the UK and rewrapped certain items, and finally from 1940 when the Reverend Bonarjee wrapped selected manuscripts before sending the entire collection over to the Bodleian. That the archive remained intact through such conditions suggests that it was perceived as essential, worth the burden of transport, worth preserving against the odds. But it complicates assumptions about who preserves archives and why. The actors least invested in the archive's scholarly significance nonetheless preserved its identity. Conversely, integrity was not preserved automatically by proximity to academic institutions or expertise. The archive remembers the aspirations of the times through which it traveled. In British India, reading an English language periodical and hence feeling like a prince, the urge to modernize through bridges, railways, wireless, and numerous contraptions hitting the market. In Germany, it absorbed modernist experiments in photography and the artistry of humor and a quality cigarette. It also memorialized more personal hopes and fears and a growing dread that rapidly morphed into terror. Certainly, all this is documented history, which tells us nothing new about the world, but these are also markers of entangled histories from which the archive can no longer carve out a separate identity. The archive's entry into the Bodleian marked another transformation. Mr. Hirschler, the Jewish émigré, now heading to the United States, was not interested in a piecemeal acquisition of the collection. The Bodleian was requested to hold on to the collection until Hirschler could come back to reclaim them, and the matter rested there all through the war. After the war ended in 1944, the Bodleian reached out to Miss Weiss, but she had moved on with no forwarding address. In 1944, with nowhere to send it back to, the Bodleian classified the manuscript stash as a war deposit and closed the books on it. And there the matter rested until the library stacks were reorganized in 1986. Paradoxically, it was the institutional act of forgetting that ensured its survival and stabilized its content. We know this history thanks to some fantastic detective work by the then keeper of the Bodleian, Jonathan Katz, who contacted surviving children of the Hirschler, Weiss, and Banerjee families to assemble this account. All of these descendants have since passed on, reminding us how oral histories are simultaneously tangible and ephemeral. But Katz, too, described the archive as a collection of astronomical, astrological, and ritual texts, as well as classical Sanskrit poetry and some later vernacular and devotional works, and as belonging to the Vyasa family whose traditional profession was astrology. But there is no indication as to how he arrived at this information in his article. My own guess is that this was mediated by Pingree scholarship, through which the archive moved again, this time through interpretive frameworks. Now translated as a scientific resource, its integrity, once maintained as a working inheritance, was now redefined as disciplinary coherence, which raises the difficult question of what counts as integrity and who decides. As the survivor of a series of decisions made under radically different conditions, the archive is not a static object moving through time, but a process continually reconstituted through movement and produced through encounters with refugees, with markets, with institutions, and with scholars. By tracing the archive's heterogeneity, reconstruction, familial logic, and travels, this presentation and my future article argues for an understanding of archives as relational, historically contingent objects whose meanings are never settled. Do I have 2 more minutes? Am I on time? Okay, just some concluding remarks. So this presentation began with a deceptively simple question: what kind of archive is this? And the difficulty of answering that question has been the point. What distinguishes the scholarly moment in this archive's history is not its rationality or rigor, but its selectivity, demonstrating how disciplinary frameworks can actively construct archives. The archive presented here ultimately resists closure. We do not know precisely why its original custodians preserved it in the form that they did. We do not know how they imagined its future. We cannot fully recover the meanings it held within scribal life. So to ask what kind of archive is this is therefore not to seek a definitive answer. It is to keep open a space of inquiry in which archives can be understood as dynamic, relational, and unfinished. The instability of the answer is not a failure of analysis, but its condition of possibility. And finally, the archive's most enduring contribution may not lie in the scientific data it yields, but in the questions it forces us to ask about archives themselves, about what we preserve, what we fragment, and what we are willing to recognize as coherent forms of intellectual life. Thank you very much. Stop sharing.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That was really interesting. Questions from the floor, from Zoom? Jerry.
Thank you, Priya. That was terrific. I'm interested, puzzled by the newspaper wrappings, many of which are lost, but that is a kind of evidence that you're working with to recreate, in fact, the sociology of the keepers of the archive. That would not have been available had people had blank paper to write their cover sheets with. And it's odd to me that that was an initial choice that was made. So I'm wondering whether you can think about that or talk more about that, but also that it was carried on as the archive moved to to Austria, to Europe, to places where you would have expected that the keepers of the archive would have had blank note paper, which finally is what you have at the end that destroys the contingent evidence of the papers. But have you encountered other archives that use like random sheets of newspaper as an organizing principle?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the newspapers are definitely a very unusual way in which these are the manuscripts tend to be packaged. There's usually they tend to be wrapped in usually it's red cloth, and it's known to have certain antiseptic properties and things like that, which help in the preservation. So newspapers are unusual, and it suggests to me that it might have been something that was just put away and just put away not to be taken out for reuse, just kind of boxed away as something that you just want to keep as a legacy, because this is happening in the this is happening in the early 20th century when the move to print is nearly complete. So that scribal culture is, if not already dead, on its way dying out. So they're not anymore in use, although they did have that history, but it's a family that seems to be still active for other reasons. It still seems to be, they seem to be active in the publishing business and in the general circulation of texts. So it's a part of their legacy, and so it's just kind of kept away. Even then, I would think that it would still have been wrapped up in the typical cloth kind of covering that these things are put away in. So I don't have a good answer, and it looks like that first round of newspaper wrapping just encouraged the next one.
I mean, once it moves to Europe, you might expect manila folders or whatever, right? But the newspaper continues.
Yeah, unless it's just that newspaper is very thin, and folders would make it bulkier and add to the weight, because these are sitting in 5 boxes about that. Each one is about that big, and if you put them all together, I would think it's a fairly a substantial trunk full of manuscript. So if it's newspaper that keeps the weight down, it's the easiest available, and given the quantity, maybe cloth would be quite a the quantity of cloth would be a lot as well. So newspaper seems to be the most readily available things.
Leon?
And it was so great you took all those pictures of the newspapers, because that was like a story in itself. Sorry.
I want to follow up, but first of all, thank you. This was absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, when we deal with newspapers, we deal not only with a kind of papers, at least in the 20th century, the early 20th century, there must have been aware that this is not the best quality and might have some consequences for the material they're wrapping it in. So this is not a useful wrapping material. They have to be aware of it. But what interests me are the different layers of time. When you have a newspaper article, you insist on the validity of the moment. It should be news, something that is today. You are wrapping it, however, your wrapping material is of a totally different time issue. So I wonder whether this tension is not just the tension of traveling in the location, but constant juggling of histories in the plural, of what is currently of note, and what maybe, if it's history of science, should be of note in a longer run.
So if I understood your question correctly, were you suggesting that the temporal, the layers in here, how does that feed into the history of science versus a kind of?
That's right, and it's not simply that these are temporal layers; they're temporal layers that do different things with the text that produce different sorts of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
You have a newspaper, it's a news for the day, and then frankly, you discard it.
Yes.
Maybe not.
Maybe
They
they
pile up.
They pile up, but you don't go back and reread it as it, or if you reread it, you're a historian. I mean, there is the matter that
Yes.
they become outdated.
Mhm.
You're clearly dealing with a bunch of pack rats, right? Right, they're keeping the archive and they're keeping
Well,
the
you don't
newspapers.
get-
Yes.
No, but it was really useful to help reconstruct part of the story because some of those dates initially didn't line up, and then I had to go back and see where, like the 38 newspapers in England didn't make sense because that was when Hirschler was coming out of Austria, and I knew that okay, Bonergy probably wrapped them in 40, but then I realized he must have, those 38 papers were what made me understand, because that's not mentioned in Katz's history, that he must have gone through a whole round of wrapping himself. Like maybe they suffered some damage during travel, his on the ship, and so
There was a question here, and then Rita, did you?
We got some Zoom as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Priya. This was really great and helpful for thinking about some of the messier types of manuscript objects that I encounter. I'm wondering, you were arguing that this archive or whatever we call it is kind of structured for the users, in this family or beyond the family, but and not for the concerns of modern scholarship. But I'm wondering, what can you discern about how it was structured and how it could be accessed by users? I mean, what are some of the things that are on those earlier newspapers, the notes, or what might have been before that? Because if it's just a pile of thousands of papers, then it's not really useful for users either, except as kind of scraps.
Yeah, so the original Gujarati, the Indian newsprint, has a kind of numbering system on it, which again is, it's broken now because some of it is missing, but it runs up to 200 and something. That's one of the numbers I remember. And at this point, it's hard to tell whether, they've been separated, because some of them do have numbers, and a few smaller ones, if they're just a couple of folios, they don't have numbers. So it's hard to tell at this point if they have an overwrapping, which was discarded when the inner bundles were examined. But what's useful to get a sense of the history of use is actually the text in the manuscripts themselves, because as long as you have the closing colophon, it tells you the date on which it was written, who wrote it, sometimes so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. So that's kind of what Pingree used to draw up his lineage. And then very often there's also the purpose. So sometimes, if it's a very a beginning unpolished hand, it'll say written by so-and-so for self-study. And this looks like, or Pathanartham is like, I guess, self-education, one could say. So it's somebody who, that could be translated as somebody writing it for practice, just to get a handle on the scribal technique. And then there are others where it says written by so-and-so for my son, for his study. So now this is a father writing it, maybe creating a copy for the son to practice off of or to learn reading. Sometimes it says written by so-and-so for somebody else. And so that's clearly a case where it's being written for a client who's requested that. And those tend to be a lot more professional, a lot more finished. So those are, and for whatever reason, maybe they didn't pay up or they changed their mind or whatever, those copies still stay. But there are a lot of the others which are like some of the ones I showed you, which are very, they're still in an unformed hand. They typically say for oneself, or sometimes it'll say for the general good, which also makes me wonder. I mean, this is purely speculative, but if you visit some of these, temple sites in India, even today, you'll find these little shops that sell, religious texts or little, devotional hymns and things like that. And they're not very expensive. They're not very well made. They're full of errors, but it just serves a purpose. Somebody who wants to go and maybe read through it while they're there and then they throw it away. It's not typically something you'd keep. So maybe these kind of faulty copies, scribes write it for practice, but then instead of dumping it in the trash, maybe they find some kind of, temporary purpose before they're discarded. I don't know what this, for the general good is. I'm just kind of speculating.
You get the sense that there was some sort of organizing principle that would help people find things in the collection that they were looking for?
Within this collection,
The numbers, you said.
there are numbers, but I couldn't really, frankly, I didn't spend that long and it's too fragmentary to be able to trace. I would love to be able to do that though, because there has to be, I don't know whether it's organized by genre or by ownership. It could be, different scribes within a family, each kind of numbering their own possessions. I really couldn't get a sense of that, but it is very wide. As I mentioned, some of the topics, it seems to be either these people are incredibly well read or they're just serving, multiple clients with multiple needs and interests.
My question, I think, kind of follows on. Thank you. First of all, this is just terrific. Amazing, amazing detective work, amazing story. I'm thinking of something like a method of comparative miscellanies. So what I was thinking about while you were talking, entirely different in terms of its content, in terms of its history, in terms of the work that's been done on it, is the Karaganisa fragments, right? It's another miscellany, and there has to be a method of thinking, of comprehending, of apprehending a miscellany. And I wonder to what extent there is something about this archive and that archive and other miscellaneous archives that constitutes a kind of rule, a kind of method that can be extracted from thinking about all of them in a comparative way, so that one can develop an approach of comparative miscellanies, comparative miscellaneous fragments. A miscellany could be bound and different, but this, and I realize the subject matter is totally different from the Karaganisa fragments, and the makers of it, its history, its itinerary is completely different. And yet what you're still articulating is the mystery of how does one go about thinking about that kind of archive. And I'm just wondering to what extent either there's a field of comparative miscellanies, or if there is something about this that allows you to stand outside of it and ask questions of it that one might ask of other.
Sounds like an international conference to be planned.
Yeah. Right here.
If there's anything anybody knows about miscellanies, as you explained it, I would love to hear more about it.
Yeah. May I just add? Because there is one fundamental difference that is maybe no difference. The Karaganisa, these were discarded. They were discarded.
Right.
They just
Discarded. That's
just had
great.
to be preserved.
Yes,
That's
that's
so.
great. Yeah. Discarded. Yeah. That's right.
And so the question is, keeping and discarding is actually not so different.
No, it isn't. Right, because the scholars devote enormous amount of time to poring over them, discarded or not. So these were kept. The Karaganisa were discarded, but they constitute this kind of layered history for us of miscellany, of things that are miscellaneous. I don't know. I mean, it's a question of method that I'm asking.
Yeah, there's also like the Geniza trove. There's also there's a bunch of documents that they've recovered out of the deserts of Central Asia, where there were similar kinds of things, trading slips and duty that was levied on various goods and people going in and out, things like that. And they just happened to just fall out of the watchtower and into the sand, and it was preserved for centuries. And those are like accidental. Those are discards, really. This was kept. I don't really have I've been struggling myself to find some kind of theoretical formulation that exists out there. But the one thing that I do have some hope for is maybe digital humanities might be able to find some kinds of patterns through this in terms of maybe handwriting recognition, or help us organize this material in some way in terms of classifying them into different genres and see what comes out of that. I mean, there's things that we could, I mean, it depends on the questions you ask, I suppose.
That's what I'm getting at, like a prolegomena. What are the questions asked in advance of approaching
Yeah.
miscellany?
I mean, in this context, one thing I would be curious about, because the texts go from the early 16th to the late 19th. What are the kind of, with the reading interests of a literate audience in that part of the subcontinent, if it comes to practice and things like that? What were the sort of things, there are certain things that are very representative of the Jain community, which was very prominent in that area, but then there are various other, sectarian types of groups, and you might get some sense of what, which group was, or whose works were popular. That's one. Yeah.
There's a lot of questions, but I don't
Big ones.
want to leave people on. Can I go to the Zoom?
Yeah,
All right.
comment. But there is, it's not the Ghanese, there is an act of editing that takes place in the 1920s or so. The person or people who are gathering.
The Ghanese, you're talking about
Gathering it into newspapers, right? So it's not the people in the 16th or 17th century whose organization we have any traces of. We have the traces of is it an individual?
Yes, very nice.
On the Indian subcontinent sometime in the 1920s or so who tries to bring some sort of order to these family remains that have existed over a period of centuries. And in fact, we don't know if or whether or what this person might have discarded and excluded from the archive. So, I mean, at some point you talked about, the loss of the newspapers also loses for us the original logic of the collection, but it's not the original logic. It's the logic that was imposed on it in the 1920s, right? Rather than over the centuries from the 16th century through the 20th.
Yes, the earliest recoverable, yes.
Don't we see in the fact that all of a sudden these things start moving, that there is a kind of discarding in a sense, that you could think about that, why do they move and then start to move elsewhere? Why do they move out of the family unless they're, sorry, I'm just raising that to think about that.
I actually have purely speculative answers on that.
I think Ariel actually was first and then abandoned hope, but she's first. Ariel, and then.
Okay, hi everybody. It's great that there are. I was happy to give up hope.
Ariel, hold on 1 second.
You're not muted, but something's wrong in the rooms. Yeah.
Oh dear.
Okay, try again.
Is it all right now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you again so much for this talk. I loved this kind of diachronic study of this archive as it's moved through time. It's so exciting. As you were talking about, specifically once the materials had kind of reached the institution and gone through various iterations of, what are these things? I was thinking about my own experiences as a little library assistant, sometimes going through initial collections that had been brought into the library, but not totally gone through yet. And I kind of felt as a little library assistant sometimes that I was making these huge decisions with grand implications for what materials people are studying and have access to. So I was just kind of curious about how you found conducting the research that you did about the materials once they had entered the Bodleian. Like, what sort of records were there about the, obviously there was provenance records, but about the institutional history of the materials. Could you just talk a little bit more about conducting that research? It's kind of meta archival research almost.
Yeah, and that's a really important question. Thank you for asking that. The material, I've showed you some pictures of how it's partially cataloged by Pingree, and the rest of it is in its raw, uncurated form. And that's really how it's presented if you go and want to research it, which I think is highly unstable and highly undesirable, because they're just giving you this box of stacks of stuff. Like I was at the APS recently, and they will give you the same thing too, in certain situations. But every page is in its own folder and marked. And so everything is accounted for. But this is, there is no master list. And what is really unfortunate.
Call it unprocessed and.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the items that the German Indologist had mentioned as being particularly ancient, and which the Oxford professor wanted to see, you see the wrapping. The wrapping is there. There's nothing inside.
Oh.
So it's a really it's.
Of course, it could have been taken out and recatalogued by the Bodleian.
I asked them if it was out for exhibit or something because it's the earliest, but they didn't.
I don't know.
I don't want to say that, but
Made its way to that professor's office.
so it's fantastic that they make it available for researchers, but I think it's a highly unstable and undesirable situation. And it seems to be a good case for digitizing like we do here. A lot of our manuscripts here are digitized and you can see it beautifully unless you really have a really strong reason.
Caveat from the librarians, you can't digitize without cataloging it. And you've got to process it first, otherwise you'll just have a digital mess. It's like you have a physical one. So
That's true.
I just wanted to thank you then for bringing our attention to this unprocessed collection, because I found digging into the institutional history of the collection, it's a really fascinating branch of this kind of work. So thank you again.
Thank you. And I also want to say that it's it's unusual because a lot of Indic material, which was put together by, it was colonial scholars who went scouting for this material first, and they did a very rigorous round of culling themselves. There were certain texts that met the standard if they were important texts, canonical texts, particularly antiquated, or if they had illustrations. So there were certain things which made the cut, and a lot of stuff got trashed. So to find something like this which hasn't been processed is really, very unusual and very special. In Europe, you do find a lot of these kinds of
and just a note from Dagmar in the chat. Fair enough, Bodleian is chronically understaffed and doesn't have unlimited resources.
Thank you, Dagmar. Yes.
Susan Wyman, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
You took me back to my PhD thesis of the Verney letters. The Verney letters were found in the top of a house, full of boxes, and there were papers of 14 generations between 1495 and 1810. And it was fragmented, it was cheek by jowl. And as a graduate student, I was quite overwhelmed, and it took me 10 years actually to do the thesis and then publish the book. But what we talked about, what that can tell a user or a scholar. To me, as a young historian starting out, I saw a family in its holistic whole. And instead of looking at it vertically and chronologically, I took a section of it and looked at it horizontally and tried to see all the different facets of family life. And it molded me as a historian to think in big terms and to try to somehow make those fragments and voices speak. So what I did was I ended up in just analyzing the letters of a certain period. I actually looked at 12,000 of them. And I was able, because of the letter form, to have to catalog, to have a to and a from, a place, a date, subjects. And then another scholar who had looked at the Verney letters in an earlier period, he started a digital database. And so the family eventually hired an archivist, but it has been used now by many, many different people. And I think the horizontal aspect of it, the breadth of family life comes through in a collection like this. And I feel very privileged that I was able to grapple with this huge leviathan of a collection. So thank you very much for recreating all those memories. And family scrapbooks are also similar with that horizontal way of looking at them.
Thank you so much. I'll definitely take a look at your work. It might give me some ideas as well.
There's something in what Susan was saying that, you know, that kind of, there's something thinking of method. One of the things I thought impressive was the shift of perspective that you encourage, essentially from a kind of you're not looking at the content with a specific topic, which Pingree was clearly doing, which lets him see something, which you said was useful. Then you're shifting from content sort of to thinking in terms of use, is, it seems to me, what enabled you to have this different perspective on the archive as one of a kind of scribal, a record of scribal practice, rather than a record of a family with area knowledge, you know, of say astrology and astronomy as their specialty, right? So just thinking of the material texts as showing a certain kind of use rather than as transmitting a certain kind of knowledge, right? I thought was a really important shift in your thinking, or in encouraging us to look at an archive through that lens. Could be other archives as well. Thinking about Rita's question, you know, lets us see how the texts were being used in a different way, which leads to a real question, which is the family, the bias.
Yeah.
So Pingree, I take it, did establish that they were a family with some connection to professional astrology and astronomy, but are they professional scribe? I mean, what's the connection to the scribal practice that you're showing? I mean, why is this family of professional astronomers or something like that? They also seem to be training scribes. I mean, there's people practicing handwriting, and maybe some of the fragments are only there because they embody a certain kind of script that it doesn't matter what the content is. The script is a certain style that you want to teach someone to learn, right? So were you able, like in parallel to the shift in approach, were you able to see something new about this family that kind of corresponds with what you're saying?
Or maybe it's even wrong to call them professional.
Right. I mean, was Pingree just wrong about, I mean, maybe someone was, but other people weren't. I don't know.
Well, I feel that it's not entirely accurate to call them astronomers or astrologers, because subsequently I did encounter materials that are highly astronomical in nature, and that's, you know, it's very theoretical and sometimes very pedagogical, but this is, it's not a similar kind of mix of materials at all. It's, you know, fragmentary. It's just a certain, or sometimes it's a final end product of something which might have been made for someone. So clearly these scribes are not just writers. They have, you know, drawing skills, as we saw. They are called upon to fill out, as you see, that massive horoscope, but in more humble forms, and they have to fill in the text and the tables. So they have to be capable of certain kinds of calculations to fill in that data, or unless they're getting that, you know, outsourced and getting that information from someone else. But I would suppose that the more capable scribes kind of master that aspect of computation so that they can fill in these things and deliver a completed horoscope. So my sense is that they are scribes. And the reason for that is, another reason for that is also in Pingree's own 5-volume census. If you search for the name Vyasa, you'll find a ton of results that come back at you. And these are manuscripts that have been copied by some Vyasa or the other. And they're not just here in Gujarat, but, you know, in Rajasthan, Benares, and all parts. So it seems like a kind of, you know, family or hereditary kind of occupation that the family practiced. Maybe not every member, but enough of them went into it. I also came across one in Kerala, down in the deep south, a very nicely done manuscript written by a Vyasa. I forget the first name. So yeah, that's my sense that, you know, his approach was more towards like that was a massive project, the census. It took him, I think he started sometime in 1970 and he was working on it into the 90s. So it became a very consuming project, and so a lot of material that he saw was kind of viewed through that lens. And that I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but I think that's interesting.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on exactly that point, which is how much is known about scribal culture in Sanskrit in the early part of this period before it became endangered by print. And was it a family or maybe a tribal or I don't want to use the word guild, but how was it organized? And were there other families that where a lot of people are all contributing something in that in a sort of network that would be similar? I mean, and maybe evidence for this would come from, I'm just comparing it to what we know about scribal culture in the Middle East, and schools and things like apprenticeship and other kinds of things that get described and accounted for. And so if there were other families, and there might be other kinds of within family records, maybe not correspondence, but maybe memoirs or descriptions of this scribal family, because in other kinds of documents that talk about how they got to be so prominent or something like that, that would give you a kind of a snapshot of how a family like this might have operated and why certain things might have been valuable to them.
Yeah, that would be really, really useful. There's been some general writing about, scribal culture, but in terms of like specific families following their history, it's, if there is anything anybody knows, I would love to, to read up on it. But there's a lot more about, in the Islamic context. I think there's been following, and Dagmar has done some of that herself with certain Islamic families. But within the Indian context, the Sanskrit context, I think one can only speak in very general terms, that a lot of sometimes occupations tend to be sort of hereditary. So you might have scholar families and somebody who's trained in a particular whether it's philosophy or grammar or whatever, might the children grow up within that atmosphere and enter the same profession themselves. It happens with musicians, various artisans. So it's very general. I don't think there's enough data in that granular form to speak about scribal families themselves, but that would be good future work for
Peter, go ahead.
Thanks very, very much, Priya. That was fabulous. I wanted to pick up on what Zach and Davita, I think, were implying about, which is that could this just be if it's a scribal collection, the interest will not be necessarily about content at all, except for the way you described it. The content may be what people want copied. So that's the first thing, which has got nothing to do, you actually said that at the very beginning, that it has nothing to do with authorship in that sense. It's about, you've got clients and they might want something copied. And the other crucial thing, it seems to me, is that most scribal families, whether they're in Japan or in Sumeria, are collecting examples of calligraphy. In other words, the question is how you write. And so, including quite often, like in Sumeria, a great interest in how children write. So you actually have a lot of Sumerian tablets where you've got the writing master writes and, he writes several lines and then a student copies them. And that's been preserved for whatever reason. But we have, a surprising number of clay tablets of that kind. So it just strikes me. And so that's the first question. The first question is, to what extent could this really be about calligraphy and about writing, not so much as about content at all? So the question of miscellaneity seems to be a rather different one, but equally interesting. But the miscellaneity points to content. The question of handwriting is a quite different one. It's actually, you're looking at models and what kind of models. And it might also be a combination of model handwriting and a genuine family archive where you're interested in how your own children learn to write. So that might explain why some of those rather bad, in quotation marks, bad handwriting, just as people do today, they collect their children's handwriting. The second question I have is to push back a little bit against what someone was claiming, I'm thinking so. But the question of the wrapping, that first of all, as I understand the paper wrapping, it starts in India in the late 19th century. Is that right? The paper wrappers?
It's really early 20th.
Early 20th, okay. But I think so the question I have is, if they're numbering these at the beginning, are they actually taking over a pre-organized? So are they actually retaining a folder? What you would put it crudely, a folder system. So is this not a new folder system, but actually preserving an older folder system? They must have been preserved somehow. And obviously, one of the ways they were preserved, was just simply by putting a piece of string. And I take it that's the question of the holes going through the middle, which you showed that they're no longer preserved that way, and perhaps never were preserved. I couldn't see, some of them had holes through the middle and other ones didn't. Do you remember what I'm talking about there?
Yes.
So this is typical of sort of palm leaf technology.
Yes.
And so, I'm just interested, there must have been preserved in some way in an archival from the earliest times. And I'm wondering to what extent you could have any evidence that the earliest printed wrappers from the 20th century are actually replacements of some other system of wrapping, which actually is preserving the organization. And so the organization then might be by date. I don't know. These are the questions I'd have. Do they look like it's just things shoved together by date and, from a certain period? They had dates on them, I thought. Is that right? Some of the wrappers have dates on them. So I presume there is a system of some kind, which is just maybe by time. And that would be, again, a very simple, widespread organizational system. You just gather things. It's a sort of lowest level organization, if you like to call it that, but it is an organization. So those are really the two questions: as to what extent is the preservation of these folders, of a system anyway, of archiving by folder, which is preserved in the newspaper wrappers. And the other question is, to what extent might these collections be more about calligraphy and about things that you need for that people want copied, they actually text that they might want copied?
Yeah, I'll address the low-hanging fruit first, which is the hole in the middle, and as you rightly mentioned, that they hark back to the palm leaf manuscripts. And palm leaf manuscripts, of course, were, that's how they were stored. They were not bound together. There was a hole bored right through the middle, and you ran a string through, and then wooden boards, top and bottom, and then you tie it up. But then with the move to paper, the same format, stayed. And so you didn't need a hole, because these things would, they were paper and they didn't need to sit between. Sometimes they do still sit between boards, but they just marked I think there are probably some early instances where there was a hole, but then the hole went away, and then they marked a big circle to kind of show it. And then you'll find even later manuscripts where there is no hole, but the text has a break in the middle, just to make, space for this little blank diamond, which is just a memory of this, the vestigial aperture that used to be there on palm leaves. So that, and then eventually even that goes away. So there's a kind of a chronology that one can trace there. In terms of the organization, whether the earliest wrappings actually reflect that, it's really hard to tell. I mean, one could probably look at the texts that they contain and see if, as you say, there is some logic of chronology or ownership or subject, but one would have to really look at, and it's incomplete evidence at this point, but one would have to look at what's left to try and recover what that organization was. And I don't think, unfortunately, there's any way to tell how that relates to whatever might have existed in the past before that. The earliest newspapers are 1913 and then 1915. They all seem to kind of fall into the same phase. But then the next phase in 2029 seems to keep that first one, because some of them are actually rewrapped twice, so that 1913 is underneath and then the 29 is over. Sometimes it's just the 29, but then there's a note saying reviewed and And it's written in English, actually. So it says reviewed and something by some Vyas. And then there's a date on it. So somebody's actually looked at the earlier stuff and maybe, you know, this is my guess, maybe just removed peeling, wrapping that's just falling apart and replaced it with something new. That goes from 13 to 29. And that's my guess. I mean, I'm just, there's no way to tell for sure.
And there's a question, there's a couple things in chat too.
Yeah, and then quickly with the calligraphy, that's also a really interesting question. I don't think they really aimed for a particular preferred handwriting style, because you see a lot of really professional, well-done manuscripts, and they're all in very different styles. So my sense is that they, you know, focused on the clarity of the script and getting it written nice and clean, but then there was a good deal of latitude there in terms of individual scribes developing their own styles. I don't know if that might have had something to do with, you know, clients also, you know, preferring specific scribes for that reason.
I know that you're reluctant to speculate, but I think that there is an important turning point of this story, which is this young medical student who is leaving home.
Oh, yes.
With a case full of his family's archives going back hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Seemingly randomly wrapped in newspapers that were from when he was tiny, probably.
Yeah.
So what do you know about this person, and what do you think this traveling archive meant to them as they went to Austria? Had it become wealth that he could turn into, which is what he ultimately did? Was it memories? Was it anticipated it would be useful to him at all in any other sort of way? You know, what did it mean for the people that were sending him off with this tangible history?
Okay, so I have to speculate. Yeah. And it's a really interesting part of this history, which, you know, we were never really going to know for sure. I tried, when I was in Oxford, I tried reaching out to Professor Katz, but he was in London and he was coming back the next day and I missed seeing him. I would have loved to know how he got that information as to that this was a student named Vyas. I did ask at the Bodleian and they said, you know, if there were notes of his conversations with these people, and they said, well, there are notes, but most of it has been transferred to his a little article that he wrote. And that article just said this was a student from India named Vyas who came to study. A subsequent article said that he was a student of medicines. I don't know if that came out of, you know, his notes where there was that little bit of detail. So I did try to reach out to the University of Vienna with Liliana's help, actually, and try to track down this person. You know, was there a student enrolled in the 1930s by this name? Can't be that many Indians. 30s in the University of Vienna. And they said, you have to give us a particular department. So I said, the university, the Department of Medicine. And they said, no Vyas. So then I said, how about the Department of Philosophy, maybe something very general. And then they came back and said, no, we have no record of Vyas. So then I figured I'll let it rest a little bit. And I'm going to go back and ask about law and a couple of engineering, maybe, and just a couple of other things. But it's interesting that, you know, there is no record. The story clearly said that he was a student of medicine. Which leads to some other speculations in terms of, you know, this is the 1930s when you have to consider the situation in India. It's a time of, you know, extreme political ferment because India eventually becomes free in 1947. And so the 30s are, you know, where there's a lot of political unrest. And it's not just at the political level because there are Indian, you know, political parties agitating for independence, but it's also at the level of the street. And, you know, Gandhi has just come back and there's the Salt March and the disobedience movement, I think, is a little later. The Salt March, I think, is like early 1930, where he goes and picks up salt from the sea, which is a crime because that's supposed to be taxed by the British. And so there's a huge amount of, like, you know, popular resistance. So these are young men who are, you know, also living in that time. There's also a lot of people, a lot of young students who are who want to participate in this movement, but who, you know, are the British are going to get them, and so they go abroad to get away from the British. Some of them go to England, but the British are keeping very close tabs on them there. So they go to Europe and America, where they can operate with a little more freedom, and where the arm of the British law can't get to them. And there's a lot of, the most famous one is Udham Singh, who was, you know, this very famous, he's been written about quite a bit. who grew up as an orphan and found his way to the United States and found expat Indian communities here, helped them, got their help to raise resources, was involved in gun running because he was convinced that the only way to get the British out is through armed resistance and smuggling weapons in and all that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of that happening, these kinds of people circulating, but it was all under the surface. Nothing is open. There's, there were definitely, and I have spoken to people who were, very young at that point, but who were in Europe and England and who talk about these people moving around and these kinds of meetings where, they're talking about how you can get the British out of India. So those are conversations that are really happening at that time. So one has to wonder even about his identity as a student, we really don't know. And in that case, one has to wonder what, in that context, this manuscript trove, was it something that, you suggested that his family gave it to him. Did they give it to him, or did he just take it because of the way it's so crammed together? I mean, some of the material in there's like stacks of postcards and correspondence. That can't be any value for anybody. So it looks like it was just taken in a hurry, and went with it. So who knows, maybe he didn't even have his parents' permission. It's like a lot of, and like I said, I'm speculating, but these are, just questions
But
that come
it's
up.
pretty bulky. It's not light. I mean, it's something you don't, it does have the quality of a kind of refugee story of, like
really
you take something that really matters to you. It's not, I assume it wasn't an easy trip for this person to Vienna, to bring a trunk of paper, of paper that's not necessarily easy to turn into a lot of money or something. It's not like smuggling silver out or something, right?
Yeah.
Suggests the some sort of like this is emblematic of his family or something to go to all that trouble to take it out.
Let me just, can I just read Mitchell's question? Mitch had to leave, but he poses a question on this exact topic that everybody should hear. On the nature of unknown knowledge and in the Indic manuscripts, the idea of so many people who couldn't read Sanskrit, of course, we don't know about this refugee or whatever, valuing this collection and passing it on is a fascinating observation that you made, Priya. Thank you for that. And I wonder, Mitch says, about how the mysterious or unknowability of these items to European non-Sanskritists played a role in establishing them as a corpus. Not throwing things away or throwing things away based on knowledge or not knowledge.
Yeah. I think the refugee aspect of it is really fascinating. I met somebody, I can tell you that story later. I don't know if some of you are familiar with Frank Stanish. He's a historian of medicine and neuroscience. And he's written this article about what did they carry in their luggage about refugees. And he talks more about, just neuroscientists there. And he's talking about how many of them had to leave and restart their, profession all over again with nothing. They could carry their books and their data and their photographs and, instruments and all that stuff. But some of them did with varying, degrees of success, loss, theft, customs, whatnot. But what he says is, for the most part, most of them just left with a few clothes and some seed money and, lists of, contact information of colleagues, international colleagues that they could reach out to. So if that's the general, that seems to be the general impression of, educated, well-placed individuals fleeing. And this was also Hirschler. I remember reading somewhere, it said that he ran a household goods business, which initially I thought was like a mom and pop store, but somewhere else it said that he lived a fairly aristocratic lifestyle. So that would suggest a comfortable home and valued possessions and all of those things. So when somebody's fleeing, you have to make decisions of what to take, and a box of, raggedy manuscripts that you can't read is not really a priority,
If you can't read them, you might assume that they're very valuable.
Yeah, I think that's part of the point, Mitch, is, it's the value is,
is what they read in.
Really, really valuable. Yeah.
And they aren't like, if you look at, for instance, Islamic manuscripts with lovely, illustrations and illuminations and beautiful calligraphy. This is a very different bag of. So it's one of those mysteries that, kind of, I think it pushes against the limits of historicizing and theorizing, and people are going to be,
Thank you, Priya. This is, I don't know, I mean, I read this and it's really gratifying to be presented and get all this wonderful feedback. So I think all the important information or the real kind of serious substantive questions have been asked about the material aspects of it. I just kind of wanted to give a little macro sense, and I don't know if you've thought about it, we haven't talked about it yet about this collection, this article, but I'm just wondering, one of the things that is this idea of finding coherence in the archive. I mean, this is a question that kind of sits between Zach's and Peter's and questions asked here about methodology and about how we actually move from this kind of scribal archive to the scientific corpus and things that what Pingree was doing. It kind of reminds me of a kind of a weird kind of dissonant point that we're at in index studies, Indology and other things where, it took almost a century for example, for philosophers of epistemology, right, in India, all these scholars who were looking at the ancient Indian philosophical texts to kind of find an entry point into having conversations with other philosophers, right, about Spinoza and Shanti, Takirti, all these wonderful scholars who work on epistemology across space and time. So in a kind of a global material history of global text and creating all these things, I'm just wondering, one of the issues now is that there's a kind of a thought that, okay, we've kind of entered into the conversation, but on whose terms, right? There's a kind of a sense now that like all these philosophers and epistemologists are kind of trying to fit their thing into a scheme of how you talk about philosophy of mind and pramana studies. So a lot of these scribal archives have their own kind of logic, this kind of formation of knowledge. So this is a big problem of how how does knowledge get brought out in terms of a future of looking at these of any of these archives that had a coherence of their own, which I know you're having difficulty locating, but I think you're moving in that direction. And then you have, of course, how they've been located already by Pingree and others, and into this kind of larger scheme. So it's kind of a broader macro question about the problem of global comparative work and on one level, but also, the significance and where you might find actual pragmatic points of finding a coherence that's not doing violence to the sources. So I'm wondering if you thought about that with this archive or in general. It's a big macro question.
It is. It's definitely there at the back. I don't think I have any answers for it, but I think as more and more of this kind of material comes out, we shouldn't kind of, leave it, because that was, even for me, that was my first instinct. I spent 3-4 days with this looking for something specific. I went in there with a certain set of expectations. I didn't find it. And then I realized, okay, this isn't going to work for my PhD. And I just put it aside. I said, I'm here at Bodleian, let me look at other stuff. And I just put it aside. But then for whatever reason, it nagged at me. And, I went back to it. And then I went back with no expectations. And then, these ideas kind of suggested themselves. I think, rather, our first instinct is to move it away if it doesn't fit certain, predetermined categories that we have. But if we stick with things that make sense to us and we talk about it, and, and more people talk about it, and there's a conversation going, I mean, I guess just more communication, I guess, is the way to bring things into kind of mainstream. I mean, they don't have to be the mainstream. They're very.
There's great value, right? I mean, to bring up this like something into conversation with already an established body of knowledge and create a wider global conversation about that is so important. And yet there's the other side of it where it's like there's a threat of it kind of losing another kind of more fragile and vulnerable knowledge in service of assimilating it very quickly,
Yeah, but also, to its credit, the Bodleian has held on to it. They didn't go through the kind of curative systematizing that they would typically have done, and they seem to have understood that there's, they understand that there's value to it. So I think it's the important fact is that it survived, and now if they can, stabilize it and make it available, I think it's just more, more people doing work in these messy corners and making it not so, I mean, maybe it'll always be messy, but not so unusual.
Well, I think we'll let you stop there. This was a fascinating journey you took us on. One lesson is be careful of the side that could end up taking over the next 20 years of your career very easily.
Different because